Hi, everyone. My name is Misty Kruger, and I am really excited to be talking to you today about Jane Austen's Sanditon in context before and after 1817. So first things first, just a reminder, Jane Austen wrote a story that is called Sanditon, but might have been called The Brothers. It is assumed that the brothers might have taken the tale in a different direction, but because Austen didn't get to finish it, we don't know where that would have gone. It is rumored that the family and Austen kind of fondly referred to the tale as Sanditon. So after Austen's death, that is what it became. It became a tale called Sanditon. She finished about 24,000 words before abandoning the text in March of 1817 due to health conditions. So she spent a few months on it and then had to set it aside, unfortunately. One of the things that I and a lot of people ask is what inspired Austen to write this novella, right? This tale, what was happening here? We only have the fragment, but we have a lot of clues. So today I want to share with you a few things that I'm following up on. What did she read? Surely what she read inspired her to write this tale, as well as stories that were told to her by her family and possibly friends. And then, of course, we know her declining health really has a connection with the characters in Sanditon. So let's start with what she read. And you'll notice I have that little question mark there because we assume that she read some of these things because she actually mentions them in Sanditon, but others are kind of speculation. So here's what we assume that she read. We assume she read them because she mentioned them. In Sanditon, she mentions some literature, and that would be poetry by Robert Burns, Thomas Campbell, James Montgomery, Sir Walter Scott, and William Wordsworth. She also refers to Fanny Burney's Camilla and Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. And Burney and Richardson were two of her favorite authors. But she probably also read some sea bathing tales. There's an example from Anna Barbeau, who wrote under the pseudonym of Henry Homelove, called Letter on Watering Places. And I bring this one up just because watering places was a term used to describe those seaside towns, those kind of health towns like Sanditon. She might have read Thomas Skinner Sirr's The Magic of Wealth, which is also about a seaside town. We know that she and her brothers had read another tale or another text by Skinner Sirr. Surely Austen read some pamphlets on the effects of sea bathing, and then probably also a lot of caricatures about the people who go to these seaside towns to have the famous health effects of sea bathing. So in addition to just thinking about what inspired her to write Sanditon, I am interested in what inspired her to create characters that were new to her, like Miss Lamb, Mrs. Griffiths, and the Miss Beauforts, who travel to England from the Caribbean. So we have family anecdotes. I put a question mark here again because it's like, is it possible? I think it is. I think that Austen had heard from her sister-in-law, Fanny Austen, who was from the Caribbean, who would have been considered Creole. I think that she heard from her, and that might have inspired her to think about creating a Creole or a transatlantic character, possibly also from her brothers who were naval officers and traveled the high seas. I think that maybe she read some fictional tales, or at least heard of some, that were focused on transatlantic travelers, maybe even specifically on women travelers crossing the Atlantic. And then, of course, there are historical events that probably influenced Austen to think about creating a character such as Miss Lamb. So that leads me to my next question. What inspired Austen's only character of color? And that would be Miss Lamb. So I am tracing some things that I'm following up on. This isn't a complete list. This isn't even, I'm not even proposing this is like a completely accurate list, but I just wanted to share with you some of the things that I'm looking into. And first off, I just want to say like a big shout out to Devaney Lozer for all the work that she's been doing on Austen's father, being that trustee of an Antiguan plantation, and the work that she's also doing on the naval careers of Austen's brothers. So let's start with Austen's father. So from the 1760s forward, he was this trustee. And it's possible that he had mentioned that to Jane, that she knew about it and was kind of somehow tucking it in the back of her mind. Maybe it even resurfaced in Mansfield Park, but possibly also at the end of her life as she was writing Sanditon. Then there's Justice Mansfield's decision in Somerset versus Stewart. So we know that she ended up writing a novel that she called Mansfield Park. So definitely she is trying to make that connection. And if you're not aware, this decision basically states that an enslaved person, once they set foot on English soil, cannot be forced to return to a position of enslavement in a place like, say, Jamaica. All right, so 1780s and 90s, Frank from the 1780s, Charles from the 1790s had very successful naval careers. And while Austen was alive and also after her death, they had very notable encounters with slave ships and with life in the colonies and the plantations. And surely some of that affected the way that Austen thought about writing a character of color. Then late 1700s, the early 1800s, thinking about all those anti-slavery campaigns and texts that Austen might have been familiar with, even have read. We know she was a fan of Thomas Clarkson, a very famous abolitionist. She absolutely loved the poet Cooper, and maybe she'd read his poem, The Negro's Complaint. And then 1807 would be the act for the abolition of the slave trade. And again, Austen definitely knew about this. And this was probably also on her mind as she was thinking about writing characters, maybe characters that were just alluded to in Mansfield Park, but a character that actually exists and would have been developed more in Sanditon. Surely there are other texts and events that I don't have on this list, and I would love for you to drop them in the comments if you know of any, or if you have any thoughts on the text that I've put up here on the screen, or events, something that I'm leaving off this list. So I'll offer a few more. These are literary. The first is another one of Austen's favorite authors, Maria Edgeworth. There's information in Belinda that might have affected the way Austen thought about creating Creole characters, transatlantic characters. Maybe she read The Grateful Negro. I can't say that she read Woman of Color, but it's a text that I teach. And so I'm going to share a little bit about that with you today and let you think about some of the similarities between Miss Lamb and Sanditon and the character who is the titular woman of color. So that's from 1808. And then in 1814, you know that Austen published Mansfield Park. And then 1816, she was working on Persuasion. So obviously Mansfield Park has Sir Thomas Bertram, who is an Antiguan plantation owner, meaning that he owned enslaved people. And then Austen's Persuasion is obviously focusing on, characters like Wentworth and the Crofts, and even in that kind of brief mention of Miss Smith's rights to her husband's property, meaning a plantation. So these are the things that I think are kind of just in the background of the story that results from the question of, what might have inspired Austen to create her only character of color. But surely, like I said, you have some other ideas. So I would love for you to drop those into a chat or send them to me in some way. All right, so like I said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the woman of color. It's an anonymous tale. We have no idea who wrote it. We have no idea about anything related to this person. This image that you see on the screen is the picture of the Broadview edition. It's edited by Lyndon J. Dominique, and it has a lot of really fantastic textual materials preceding and following the woman of color. So I highly recommend that you buy this book. So here are some things that you might want to know about our heroine from the woman of color, just so that you can kind of think through like, I wonder how this might kind of make a connection with the character of color that we see in Austen's tale. So the heroine of the woman of color is a character named Olivia Fairfield. And Olivia's name, I would say, is punny. and also symbolic. So Olivia is a reference to skin color, meaning her olive skin. And Fairfield might have something to do with the fairness, of her person. It might have something to do with her skin color as well. Field might have some kind of reference to the plantation. Who knows? But if you put them all together, you kind of see that this was very purposeful. So Olivia is from Jamaica. She is a free woman of color, so she was never enslaved. And she is biracial in that her father was a white plantation owner, her mother an enslaved woman of color. She is now the heiress to her father's estate because both her parents are deceased. So Olivia is, we assume, the woman of color from this tale, but she's not the only woman of color that we meet in the story. There's Olivia's servant who's named Dido, and Dido is also Jamaican, but as you can see, she is a servant. She also has darker skin than Olivia's, and then she travels with Olivia to England. So the story begins with Olivia and Dido en route to England from Jamaica. And it's supposed to be one-way travel. Olivia is only supposed to be going to England to marry her white cousin, who is going to gain her inheritance. And that was one of the stipulations of her father's will, that you get this inheritance if you marry your white cousin who happens to live in England. And because she's so fair, right? She's so wonderful, she agrees and she goes to England. Unfortunately, as I said, it's supposed to be one way. It ends up being round trip because a lot of stuff goes wrong when she gets to England and she ends up returning to Jamaica. So there are some similarities between Olivia and Miss Lamb. So I will go through those. One of the similarities is obviously that they're pretty much the same age. We don't really know the exact age for Olivia, but Miss Lamb is said to be 17 years old. Olivia and Miss Lamb are both biracial women of color. They are both heiresses. The only difference I would call your attention to is that Miss Lamb is called half mulatto by Austen. And it's a really strange way of putting it, because for Austen to have called her mulatto would have been a descriptor that would have, basically explained what she was trying to get at. So I'm not sure why half is there. I have some speculations, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And then another similarity, obviously, is that they both travel with their maids to England. And Olivia travels to carry out her father's will, right, and to give that wealth to her cousin. So there's a slight difference here, and that Miss Lamb doesn't travel for that reason. She travels with her maid for health reasons to England. But we also learn that like Olivia, whose wealth is kind of in danger of being taken over by her white family, so is Miss Lamb's wealth in danger, because all of these white men, but in particular, Sir Edward Denham is, all these white men are trying to woo Miss Lamb so that they can, take her money. Of course, we don't see how that would have worked out. It's just kind of, we get the hint of that. We definitely know that Lady Denham has set her sights on getting Edward and Miss Lamb together. So some differences also are important. So I don't want to just say, oh, I found all these similarities, so it must be the same. I just want to point out to you that these two characters are very different in terms of their disposition. So Olivia is very confident and talkative, and also she doesn't seem to have any health problems. Miss Lamb is said to be in poor health. She never utters a word. She doesn't even get a line in Jane Austen's text, but Austen calls her chilly and tender. And we kind of wonder, does chilly have to do with oh, I'm cold? Tender is her frailty? Probably. Could it also have something to do with a kind of dismissive idea about her attitude? Maybe. And of course, like I said, Olivia intends to stay in England. Miss Lamb, I guess, is only coming as a health tourist and doesn't intend to stay there, but who knows, right? We don't know what would have happened, and we don't even get to hear from Miss Lamb anyway. So what I always want to know, and my students want to know, and I bet you want to know, is what would Austen have done with Miss Lamb's character? And of course, we'll never know. But a lot of writers have ideas, and they have worked through those ideas to continue the story. So we never would have even gotten Sanditon if it hadn't been published. So here's what we do know. We know that Sanditon was published in 1925 by Oxford University Press. And until then, it was kept in the family as a manuscript, right? That it was just passed around amongst family members. In particular, it was passed from Jane Austen's sister Cassandra to Anna Austen Lefroy after Jane's death. And Anna Austen Lefroy is the niece to Jane and Cassandra, supposedly the favorite niece, the writer niece, the niece that worked with Austen on texts like Sir Charles Grandison, the play, who finished or tried to finish Evelyn. So they had a very close relationship. They even talked about writing together. And then there's this fact that Anna also tried to finish Sanditon. So this is a really big deal, that Anna, tried her hand at finishing the story. And then we also know that Austen's Sanditon, and I'm going to guess probably also Anna's, was read by the Lefroy's brother, James Edward Austen Lee, who ended up writing this very famous memoir of his Aunt Jane Austen. In the memoir, he says that Sanditon is unfit for publication. He also said the same thing about the Juvenilia. P.S. He was wrong. All right, so I want to now move to talking about Sanditon after 1817 in terms of what we'll call a continuation and then what we call a completion. So as you might guess, a continuation just means that the story is being continued, but a continuation doesn't mean it's completed. So in order for us to get to completions, we have to get to the end of a story. It has to feel wrapped up. So what Anna Lefroy actually worked on sometime between the 1830s and 60s is what we'll call a continuation. She didn't finish it. We don't know why. We do know that it was finally made public in 1977 when it was sold at auction. And then in 1983, it was finally transcribed and printed in a very rare edition of a book that I just got my hands on. I'm very excited about. Then, as you can see, there are other tales that are either called Sanditon or they refer to Sanditon, but they also acknowledge that there is someone else kind of completing the story. So Sanditon by Jane Austen and Another Lady from 1975. It has been discovered that that other lady is Marie Dobbs. It begins with Austen's chapters, and then Another Lady picks up and completes the novel. Julia Barrett does the same thing. So does Juliet Shapiro. So even Shapiro, Shapiro's tale actually says completed, so that we know this isn't just a fragment, this is now the whole thing. I want to kind of walk through 3 of those 4 texts that I just showed you. And of course, I'm going to start with Lefroy because it's the first one, but also it's the one that might have the closest bearing to what Austen might have done, because Lefroy and Jane Austen probably talked about ideas. This is kind of just, right, again, the anecdotal evidence that they talked about ideas for Sanditon. So here are the things that we get from Lefroy. And this is it. There is nothing more than this. The continuation is actually very short. So we'll have to leave it to other writers to give us more details. But I wanted you to see what we get from Lefroy. So Miss Lamb is described as wearing a thick veil and a wrap to guard her from the summer breeze. So that has to do with that sickly constitution. She rides a donkey for exercise. I just feel like that's got to be a reference to Jane Austen there. She's an heiress who has a bunch of men vying for her inheritance. In fact, Lefroy calls them ciphers. Lefroy refers to Miss Lamb as a little black girl. So obviously the little part is about the stature, right? That I think she is supposed to be small, frail. I don't know why Lefroy calls her a black girl, whereas Austen calls her mulatto. I'm not really sure what Lefroy's term is getting at. And that's something I would want to spend more time thinking about, but maybe you already have thoughts and can share those with me. And then the next one is that there's a passage where Miss Lamb is described as being someone who actually likes to be left alone. She likes to play with her little dog. She likes not having to go anywhere or quote unquote take an interest in anything. So this is about that personality of kind of being shy and timid. And Lady Denham, in thinking about, who Miss Lamb is and what she does, says, oh, what more could her Creole nature desire? So this Creole reference is partially about race, but it is also about lifestyle. It is about people who grow up on a tropical island as opposed to the, England as its own island. So I want you just to kind of consider what Lady D is doing when she says, what more could her Creole nature desire? And in fact, really the last bit that we get from Lefroy about Miss Lamb is that Lady Denham, describes her as being shy, timid, and then indolent. And the indolent is connected to this idea of her Creole background. Lady Denham actually, refers to the shy, timid, and indolent as being kind of a sign of her being from the West Indies, which is this overarching term to describe the Caribbean. Except that Lady D says West Indians, which to me is kind of like a racial slur. Lady D is also trying to convince Diana Parker that Miss Lamb is actually someone who wants to go out and be properly introduced around town and, kind of brought forward and to be put before the Miss Beauforts who are getting all of the attention. Of course, there's no evidence for this. But what we do know is that Lady Denham wants Miss Lamb and Sir Edward to get together. So she's making this up so that Diana will start to help her make sure that that happens. So this is it. This is all we get from Lefroy. We get a whole lot more from that another lady from 1975 and then Juliet Shapiro in 2003. So I will share with you some of those details. And I'm just going to say, sorry, plot spoilers. Okay, so let's begin with the 1975 tale. First thing I want to call your attention to is that Miss Lamb gets a first name. I love this. She gets a first name. I'm like, oh, wow, she's an actual person here. Her name is Adela. Like Lefroy, like Austen, Dobbs decides that Adela Lamb is going to be sickly. She's going to be shy, sincere, silent, slight and frail, and nervous around more than one person. But here, at least we get a sense of what is the health condition that brought Miss Lamb to Sanditon, and apparently it's migraines. Something that's kind of interesting is that Dobbs says it's not just her health that makes her appear shy or slight, but it's also her quote unquote half mulatto inheritance. And so that's drawing on Austen's language, but also really focusing on that connection between the inheritance, race, and then personality. So she says it's her health, her half mulatto inheritance, and her reticence that always keeps her in the background on social occasions. So this is kind of getting at what Lady Denham was implying at the end of Lefroy's text. The catch here is that as the tale develops, we learn that she is liked by everyone. Everyone loves Miss Lamb. So who's the real Adela Lamb? Finally, we get to learn more. The real Adela Lamb enjoys walking on the beach and looking at the seaweed that washes up and the seashells that she finds. And I'm just like, hey, that's me too. But in particular, we learn that the reason that Dobbs kind of brings us into the plot is that Miss Lamb says all shells remind me of my childhood. At home in Barbados, there were such beautiful shells. My father made a collection of them and I have it now. And then says to Charlotte, would you like to see it? So here, obviously Barbados is the place in the West Indies that Dobbs chooses to locate Miss Lamb's origins. And there's also a kind of, I think, statement about the relationship between Adela Lamb and her father. But finally, I have this collection, would you like to see it, is an opportunity for Miss Lamb to share some of herself with these people in England. And as kind of we learn from the narrator who is kind of interpreting things through Charlotte's perspective, this encounter really transforms Miss Lamb from this quote unquote timid young girl into a voluble enthusiast. So the great thing is that Miss Lamb is like an introvert. But once you find the thing that she likes or she feels comfortable talking about, she will talk your ear off. And how many of us can relate to that, right? But notwithstanding all of this greatness, there is still this underlying struggle for autonomy that Dobbs is picking up on and carrying through the text. So while Miss Lamb is a naturalist, while she loves being outside, she's constantly being kept indoors. So Mrs. Griffiths is always like, you got to get inside, you're too sick. But Adela wants to be outside. It's where she feels comfortable. So she's described as this quote unquote genuine invalid who really despised being sick because it was perceived as weakness. She disliked talking about her symptoms, right? So she kind of kept it to herself. And she became overtaxed just by the eagerness to lead a normal life whenever she was capable of it. So she really just wants to be a regular girl. She wants to have friends. She wants to hang out with them. And the friends that she is closest to will be Charlotte and Arthur. So she invites them up to see her seashell collection and then also her beautiful watercolor sketches. And they're amazed. So here's the big kind of spoiler thing that I just had to share with you. Adela falls in love with Arthur. And it's like, squee. So we learn that Miss Lamb pretends to feel better than she actually is, just so that she can go out and be with Arthur. She goes to a dance and she sits with Arthur. She is supposedly referred to as his dear little Miss Lamb. And then Arthur, Adela, and Charlotte love to spend time walking on the beach. And Miss Lamb even says, if I could spend my whole life by the sea, I would be perfectly happy. Notice she doesn't say which sea. And then finally, this is such great news. Arthur is also in love with Miss Lamb, and their love actually improves their health. Like, it's a win-win. Another spoiler, they get engaged. So Adela and Arthur get engaged, and I am just like over the moon for this, but apparently everyone else was too, except Lady Denham. So the engagement is pretty much the sensation of the season. And the funny thing is that Arthur and Adela worry that no one's going to accept this. It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with health. So they think that everyone's going to think they're too weak. Their invalid status will be something that people will go, oh, you couldn't possibly make it on your own. Lady D, of course, really just is kind of pissed at Edward because he didn't do enough to get Miss Lamb for himself. But Tom Parker is so excited that Arthur has snagged an intelligent wife and a rich one too. So Miss Lamb, Mrs. Adela Parker now, gets her happy ending. What does that look like? It looks like this. It looks like Adela saying this: I will never be, kind of strong and healthy, but I am not a complete invalid. And I have inherited enough money to not be a burden on anyone. Also, she says, Arthur and I are going to build a house in Sanditon, so she's not leaving. And they're going to invite Mrs. Griffiths to live with them and look after them. So it works out. The best part, perhaps, for us is that Miss Lamb, now Miss Adela Parker, gets to be sister to Charlotte, who marries Sidney. So the two of them get to have not just a friendship, but a kinship in a way that they never had before. And she's so excited that she writes 5 pages about it and draws pictures. And it's like, yay! And we finish feeling pretty good, the reader. I don't feel as good when I get through Shapiro's text. So I'll walk you down this road and then tell you why I don't feel so good about it. So this is the one from 2003. Now, Shapiro's Lamb is similar to Dobbs, but with some noticeable differences. So obviously, there's this focus on she's substantially wealthy, but the way it's described is she's abominably thin and she's too precious, too sweet, and too delicate for her own good. She's quiet, but she smiles. So it's like she does her head and smiles. She is described as being beautiful, and Shapiro plays this up more than anyone else has so far. She's constantly being described as pretty, beautiful, charming. She's more charming than the Beauforts. And she's also, I guess, commended for not being man-hunting. She did not come to Sanditon to find a husband. Her skin is also portrayed in a way that's a little different from what we've seen before. It's described as a mixture of creed and color. which really perplexes me. Why is this the way that Shapiro is talking about her skin color? So tell me what you think. Drop a comment in the comments. Shapiro also says that the hue of Miss Lamb's skin is the color of creamy coffee that the party had just enjoyed. This also doesn't sit well with me because it's like you're comparing a person to a commodity. I don't know if this was purposeful, but it feels wrong. Her eyes are described as dark, which is not necessarily an insult because Austen would have said the same thing, perhaps in a positive way. And languid, that doesn't sound too good. Shapiro also says that Miss Lamb's eyes are contrastingly shiny in her dusky and pretty face. This just kind of feels like a backhanded compliment, right? Like, oh, your eyes are so shiny and you're dusky. Dusky, I don't know. I mean, this doesn't feel right. Ending with her having a pretty face sounds wonderful. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about the way that she's described here. But one thing's for sure, there's something that Shapiro does that again makes me think of Jane Austen. Shapiro says that Miss Lamb is dressed finely and wears a topaz cross pendant. Who do we know who had a topaz cross pendant? I wonder. All right, here's a big difference between what we've seen so far and what happens in Shapiro's text. Miss Lamb leaves Sanditon. So first she goes sea bathing in Sanditon, which supposedly improves her quote unquote color, posture, and humor. But she still leaves. So why does she leave? Apparently she had received some news that led her to depart Sanditon. What's the news? We're not told. All that we know is that she sent to Mrs. Griffith's sister who lives in Eastbourne, and she's supposed to be there for about a month. We assume it has something to do with health, but we don't have any answer. All we know is that when people find out that Miss Lamb is leaving, supposedly all they can think about, right, is the economic tragedy. The loss of Miss Lamb for a whole month represented an economic tragedy is something that is very Tom Parker-ish to say. So again, this is this kind of commodification of Miss Lamb that makes me feel uncomfortable. The other thing that Ms. Lamb leaving does is it opens the door for Shapiro to create a love triangle. I know, I was like, what? So Charlotte, who had already been proposed to by Sydney, and then she turned him down. Charlotte worries now that Sydney, who is also left to go to Eastbourne, is going to fall in love with, quote, pretty Miss Lamb there. So now we have a love triangle that I had no idea was going to happen, but there it was. And I was like, oh, okay. So what happens in Eastbourne? Well, again, we just learned that from letters that Miss Lamb sends to Mrs. Griffiths that she's getting treatment. What treatment? Don't know. We don't even know what her health problem is when we're in Shapiro's text. We do know from Mrs. Griffiths that if Miss Lamb hadn't gone to Eastbourne, that a certain event, a certain rather pleasing development might never have taken place. And we're like, okay, what's that, right? It's very mysterious. But Charlotte assumes it's a marriage proposal from Sydney, and that, obviously is breaking her heart. The truth is, Miss Lamb actually was meeting up with Sir Edward, and she is actually engaged to Sir Edward. And I don't know if you're like me, but you're like, no, don't do that. So does Miss Lamb get a happy ending in the Shapiro tale? I'll let you decide. She doesn't marry Edward. Once everyone finds out that Edward has basically been sleeping around with everyone and then is also secretly engaged to Clara, Miss Lamb breaks off that engagement. So we're like, whew, dodged a bullet. But then there's this. This is very strange to me, the way it's worded. So Shapiro says that Miss Lamb was carried off. Again, carried off? Like, what? Carried off by a widower of good fortune. So, okay, cool. Some 15 years her senior. I guess that's not so bad, right? Like very Mr. Knightley-ish, whom she had met in Eastbourne. So she is carried off by a widower, and we're supposed to be like, yay, because he has money. We don't know anything about him, right? We don't know why she marries him. We never learn a thing about their relationship, except this, that now she's called Mrs. Noble, and that now she's a stepmom to her husband's kids. I mean, she's only 17. She's a stepmom to his kids. I mean, is this a win? I don't know. You tell me. Is this a happy ending? The last thing we hear about Miss Lamb is that she visits Sanditon from time to time and laughs about Sir Edward. So that's the end for Shapiro's Miss Lamb, now Miss Noble. Yeah, tell me what you think. All right, so those are a few of the completions, continuations, completions. There are also a ton of adaptations out there. And then a very specific kind of adaptation that we call retelling. A retelling means like you have the characters and you have the plot, and you basically kind of retell their stories in your own way. That you give it a different perspective that is kind of close to the text, but not really close to the text at the same time. So here are a few that you might consider. And what I want to point out to you is that these are like inspirations. Like, so Sanditon serves as this point of inspiration, but then none of the text will show up in these adaptations or retellings. Sanditon is used as a setting, or it's just the characters and the plot, are the inspiration, like Reginald Hill's A Cure for All Diseases. It draws on the characters and plot. It's set in a place called Sanditon. And it's actually a retelling through this DL and Pascoe detective series, which is very famous. So I'm actually reading that one right now. And then there's this retelling, this whole world that Kate Riordan and the Masterpiece, people and all the writers, including Andrew Davies, have created in the 2019 series Sanditon, which you can also read as a book. It's basically the series, season 1, narrated, and then the word by, word for word dialogue from series 1. So if you love the series, want to read the book, go check that out. Here's a whole list of just as much as I could fit on a screen. Lots of 21st century inspired Sanditon text, so lots of adaptations and retellings. I won't go through all of these right now, but I will just point out that when you see right there, kind of in the bluish area, there are some Pride and Prejudice and Sanditon crossovers, which is kind of cool. So I'm currently reading The Suspicion at Sanditon, and I'm really enjoying that. So I can recommend that one. I haven't read the rest of them on this list, but if you have, I would love to know what you think about them. And of course, surely there are a lot more that I haven't listed here because Austen fanfic is like huge. And as you know, there are also probably more film and TV adaptations than I've listed here, but there are those things out there as well. There is a web series that I haven't seen called Welcome to Sanditon, and it's produced by the same people who did the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. There are a few films. One is basically like trying to film the story. Another is a documentary. Another is a musical. There was supposed to be another film based on the 1975 book. And then, of course, there's the PBS Masterpiece Sanditon television series, which I'm going to assume you've seen by now. But in case you haven't, here's how it goes. Georgiana Lamb is the character that we follow. She is very prominent in the series, which I love because she's not like a side character. She's also nothing like Austen's, Lefroy's, Dobbs, or Shapiro's character. In fact, I feel like she's more like the woman of color that I mentioned earlier in this talk. If you want to know what I think about Miss Lamb and both seasons of Sanditon, you can read my blog post because I've blogged about every episode. And I always talk about what I see going on with Georgiana. So check that out. Feel free to comment there or somehow get in touch with me to tell me what you think. So this is me finally wrapping it up. All right, what does all of this show us? One, this shows us that we now have some evidence for what might have inspired Austen to create Miss Lamb. We have a kind of better sense of the possibilities for a character that really, I think, could have changed the way we saw Austen's writing at the time. and how she handles a character who's a person of color. I think this would have been amazing. And then third, we also know what writers after Austen have done with the character, and what this shows us not only about Austen's time period and her world as people try to interpret it, but also how it intersects with ours. So I want to thank you for following along. I'd love to hear from you. Here are the ways that you can get in touch with me. You can comment on YouTube. You can reply to a blog post. You can tweet me at Misty Kruger. You can email me at misty.kruger@maine.edu. I hope you're enjoying virtual Jane Con. I can't wait to hear from you. Thanks for being here.